Welcome back to that build. And today, this episode is brought to you by Shaft. Steering shaft. I'm so sorry. So firstly, if you're new to the channel, this is my Porsche 911 Turbo 964 Replica. It's based off a 71 Beetle chassis, and over the span of 2 years, I have finally got to this point in time of having the space frame back on with the engine and transmission attached, brake lines, and nearly ready to turn key. One of the critical things that I am missing out of the picture right there is, of course, sitting in front of me right here, which is, of course, the steering shafts. So in amongst all the fun factor I've had with this particular car, this is more or less the latest problem I've had to figure out a way of averting, and this was the easiest way of doing it. The background is that a little while back when I was disassembling and painting and prepping the front end, I found that the steering box had been shifted over to the left-hand side by about 1.5 inches. So the offset of that was allowing the body, the new body shape and everything like that, to have the steering column still go straight. The bug, when you're sitting in that, you're a bit closer, and I believe the steering wheel is a little bit further to the center tunnel. Whereas with this, they actually had it a bit more neutral, and of course, being lower down, they also raked the steering box, so the actual angle was facing a bit more flat. It doesn't really work that way, because the trouble is that it was causing binding on the, I don't know what they're called, the front rod assemblies for the tie rods. Wow, yeah, it was way too early. Okay, so, yeah, it was more or less not the way to do it, and that's the way they had done it. But in amongst all the other stupid things that these people had done building this car, it was at least my surprise. So, the major thought I had was I need to actually keep that intact and then have the steering shaft work around that. So, going back to the engineer and talking with him, I more or less said, this is the issue, this is the idea I have, would it comply? So, you know, more or less, the idea I had before I actually have this here was to cut this shaft down, sleeve it, and then of course put on one of these universal joint shafts. The only trouble with that is, it would have been a bit more complicated to get this milled down, more cost involved on top of that, to have this one adjusted, and it had to comply in a certain way. It had to be cut and then milled or whatever without applying any extra heat to the shaft. I don't exactly know why, but again, I'm not the engineer here. I'm not the one that has to actually, you know, tick this off. I'm the one that simply has to build it accordingly and then present it to him so he can certify it. So with that being the case, I did a bit more research. This steering shaft section here is actually out of a Super Beetle. This was actually built at the same time. The standard Beetle alongside the Super Beetle had a totally different setup. It had McPherson strut suspension. The whole steering assembly was completely different, and of course, therefore, it had this with a universal shaft section as opposed to a straight column with an accordion collapsible section. So my thought was, what if we actually bought one of these and then more or less made this shaft longer, because this universal shaft, as you can see, it's a little too short. I've got the actual ends lined up perfectly here, and then on this end here, as you can see, I'm missing roughly around about, what is that, 2.5, maybe 3 inches. But there's also the factor then of the angle, because the angle is going to shift, therefore I need more metal in between those two universal joints. So, with that being the case, I am going to ditch this original factory part. Found a supplier for some universal joints which are actually ADR compliant, which is our Australian design rules, and of course what I have to adhere to. And then of course the shaft length, I'm going to anyway, go for the most furthest back position of the steering wheel itself, which should give me a bit of scope to then move it further in. And then if I wanted to, can then just shorten down that actual steering shaft length itself. So that's the idea I have. More or less, I've just got to actually bolt this into place here, which, number one, if you're noticing, these bolt holes here and those bolt holes here, yeah. So I'm gonna have to drill more holes into that, which compared to how it was beforehand, at least my job would be far neater. So there is that. The good thing is though, looking at the front assemblies, the wiper indicator stalk and the key barrel and all that sort of affair are pretty much the same like on like. So I can more or less take out all of this assembly, drop it into this, and I don't have to worry about anything. I do want to replace the bearings. I believe there's only one bearing, which is right at the very end here. It's a bit notchy, so I'll replace that at the same time. I've just got to figure out how this all actually stays in situ, because at the moment there's no bolts or anything. It only came like this, and I paid a bit for it, but again, I needed it. I had no other sellers. Literally, this is the only one I could actually find in the country, so at least I found one. That's the main thing. So I'm going to first drill some new holes, temporarily mount this, and then do some measurements. And then as far as you're concerned, this is going to be instantaneous. For me, this is probably going to be the space of 2 weeks until I have the replacement shaft to then bolt in. But I also have some rewiring to do, putting all this stuff into that. So I've got stuff to do in between. So a new curveball has been thrown my way in terms of this steering assembly. I knew it was not going to be straightforward. I pretty much got that from the get-go. Nothing has been straightforward. The trouble is that with the indicator assembly which came out of the original unit, it doesn't have as deep a dish. So this section here is considerably shallower, more shallow, compared to this one here. It sits in about at least another quarter, maybe half an inch. So that in itself is one problem. The other problem is that there's a slip bearing. Now it's different between each one, but it's kind of similar, I believe, because this one that I bought was disassembled. Didn't have any of the wiring, didn't have any of the indicator set up, ignition barrel, etc. and so on. So whether or not something's been removed, however, I don't think so. It sat rather well in there. But there was this wired one here with a bearing in the middle. It's actually a nice copper bearing too, in the original setup. And that wire led out through. I think maybe just a ground cancel out signal? I've not a clue. That was on that one, and the smaller one here was in the new one. The trouble is the height difference. The bearing itself is actually physically taller on the original compared to the new column. Regardless of the fact, I can't simply transfer the parts over to this new housing and then call it job be done, which is annoying because I've just drilled some holes, but 2 holes is not really the biggest problem. So what I think I might have to do is make a bit of a monster and chop up the existing one in order to make it work with this shaft. So I think, I'm just going to confirm that now, this bearing also, which I had to clean up, it was rather gummy, was in the bottom here. Now this is actually flanged out a little bit for that to kind of recess into. The weird thing is though that when this shaft was internally seated, where it should finish about there, this kind of wasn't long enough. Now whether or not the Boss kit is different between the cars, maybe, most likely. The shaft splines and the nut fitting was the same, but the length itself, you kind of had to either have it fully recessed up so it was fouling, or when you had it properly seated so the bearing was flush with the little lip here, then there wasn't enough space to get the Boss onto. So I really don't know. So what I think I'm going to have to do is more or less cut this pipe to length against the total length. So put this back together. Does it matter which way? I don't think so. No, okay, that's fine. So put this back in and then put that back on there. All right, so put them up this way, make it easier. And that was another thing too, is that the the ignition barrels were slightly higher, slightly off ever so much. And when I actually lined up the cutouts and everything like that, because it goes that way obviously, yeah, so resting like so, I'll bring it in. I drilled the holes based off the very end of the extension here, which would have been in line with this cutout, which would mean then that it was in the same position. That's why I drilled the holes exactly in line. So as we can see, height-wise, it's not too bad. So if I was to trim this down, and maybe even a little bit more because of the issue I've got with this shaft not really playing game. So if I had it in the original setup, obviously it would be about there. So we're finishing about there if it was flush. But I think it needs to lose a little bit more. But I'd need to trim, or flange anyway, this out to fit in. Actually, you know what, that fits in okay. I've got to replace that bearing obviously, but replacement like for like, it's going to be the same. So this might actually work. So if I trim this down, I'll trim it down by this end because this is rusty anyway. Trim this down. I'll keep it the same height for now because if I need a bit more, I can always bring it in. I can't add to it once I've actually cut it. Having said that, I've got plenty of scope in there. I can always add or subtract a little bit too, because that just clamps down and then holds it in situ. So this is the literal rat's nest of wiring which I removed from the car, and I've forgotten just how bad it was. It's seriously horrible work. Like, look at all this. Just lots of tape wound around everything. The only bit of loom back here is a horrible blue color, which is doing half the job anyway. This, I would take it as being the primary ignition wire, because that's going to this box here. Again, this has just been looped up with some random blue wire, but the blue wire is actually going to this box as well, but then it just doesn't terminate and it's just wound round. But this leads to that box, which goes through the fuse panel. So I think that might be primary. Well, that's the other side going to the fuse. That's going to the box. This then goes from the box, and I think then that might be this wire. So I'm definitely going to need a multimeter to trace all these. Although there's a big fat wire as well, but that does have a silver sheath on it on the outside, which is this one here. So at least I can identify that wire. This is going to take way too long, so I'm just going to do it off camera, and then hopefully if I figure out exactly what I'm doing, I'm going to remove all the accessory stuff I don't need, because it's getting rewired regardless. I just need a bare basic one to be able to turnkey ignition to the motor. So I'm going to go about getting this done. I'm not even going to do a montage for this one. I'll see you once finished. So what's taken me a little while, and mostly due to the creativeness of the previous wiring expert, I have sussed out just the engine electrics. So I've discarded all the body stuff. It is in the front here still, and I was at one point, I dismantled every single wire off the fuse box because I thought I'd need it. There are no fuses in this system here at all. So everything from the ignition switch straight to the starter motor, the small couple of things that come from the carburetor, and then the generator into the regulator, I believe that's a regulator, there's no fuses. So that will change, because I'll definitely be adding something, but just initially, just to get the thing running again, yeah, it's just going to be plugging these wires together. Obviously there's a heap of cable here I'm going to trim up. I might actually, for now, just make a little box or assembly or a tuck of wires behind the motor, between the firewall and everything, that I can just have all there, because this is literally all there is to the engine. That's it. And moving forward, the way I want to do it is to have the engine separate to the chassis, so that if I want to make any changes or anything like that in the future, it's really easy to do, because it's not one great big loom all strewn together. So the battery I will be keeping at the rear, just keep everything simplistic there. I wasn't totally happy with the way they mounted the battery, but it does make things substantially easier. And then all I need is about 8 or 10 trigger wires leading to the front, but I might do it as a major cable for the front, and then some smaller wires for the rear taillight assemblies. I haven't really decided on just all that just yet, but at the end of the day now, what we see here will get the engine running. I just need to trim all the wires. Anyway, I'm going to crack on with this and start neatening all this up, and then, yeah, come back to you once I've done that. decent steering, kind of. I still need to replace that tie rod. But at least now it is all assembled. It's in one piece. Everything is working as it should have been done from the first time, but let's just brush over that now and focus on the key factor here. So, new shaft from a Super Beetle, that is the key thing there. So all original factory pieces, slight modification obviously, but then the new universal couplings and the rod to go in, and it's all working as intended. So I've got scope here to be able to move the steering wheel forward or backwards accordingly. Once I get the dash back in place, obviously, that is the key factor there. So I haven't tidied this up at all, mainly because it's going to be coming out a few times in between. With that being the case as well, I do need to get some replacement bearings. Currently they're on back order, so there is that. And as I'm sure you can see, and as was visible before, but there is flex within this entire setup here. So what I'll be doing in the future is just putting a couple of triangulation braces, triangulation braces, I'm sure that's a really good term there, with a coupling, so I can actually unbolt it top to bottom, slide the entire thing in and out. The reason why I'm doing it that way and simply not welding onto the shafts, because this is quite thin metal. I don't want to warp it or anything like that. But if I need to actually adjust the rod in the future, I can still do so. Shaft anyway, not rod. But at least that way, having that coupling, I can basically just pull it in and out as I need. I'll just put like a rubber kind of donut in there so it won't rattle or anything as such. So that'll be done in the future once the shell's back on top and once this piece is going back in. And I've already cleaned all this up and know what I'm doing there with new bearings, etc. and so on. The wiring I have not tackled, won't be tackling this time around because there is a bit involved in that. For now, it is all at the rear here as shown. And of course, so it's ready for some fuel. I don't have the fuel pump installed or anything like that. I will just basically run a small jerry can up here. Pump wire, will just tap it off the battery. I think I might actually have a wire. I've got to find out what this wire is on the ignition barrel. It wasn't on my schematics. So I'll figure that one out. Hopefully I can use that as a relay tap to the fuel pump for now. But yeah, fuel issue will be sorted next. But I'm still waiting a few parts otherwise. My brake master cylinder reservoir has not come into the country. So I'm still waiting on that. Need that obviously for brakes to work. So I'm still behind in that regard, but slowly getting there, obviously. I did do a few small other things, put some grommets into some of the holes that are no longer necessary for this body. Unfortunately, I don't have all the sizes, despite buying a rather large kit, so there are a few up the front here. The great big hole for the fuel line, I have no idea what I'm going to do with that one. I cannot find one large enough, and that's actually a double skinned area, so it's quite thick metal. I've not a clue how I'm going to tackle that one. So it doesn't seem to be a genuine seal either. I don't even know, I can't see that as being the original intended purpose. I think it's supposed to go through the top. But then even the fuel grommet I did get is way too thin to fit in there, so I've not a clue. I'll figure that out in the future. For now, at least everything is as it should be. Fuel hoses are done with the fuel lines run. So that's all ready to roll. It is literally just fuel pump, brake master cylinder, bleed the brakes, and then a small jerry can. So I am very, very close to driving this once more, or actually driving it, period. I haven't actually driven this thing yet. So yeah, oh, and actually there's a little pin I need for the carburetor. Weirdly don't have one, yet I bought an entire carburetor assembly, so I've not a clue. I've either lost it or never had one, so that's another part I need to get. Again, also on back order. Or maybe it was in stock, but I have to wait for the other stuff. Anyway, apart from that, that's pretty much it. So seat to go in obviously as well. I need one of those to be able to drive it. So I do have a seat just for that. Bring that in very soon once the other parts arrived in. So more progress, finally, nearly getting there. To the point of starting work on that. Oh God, that's next. Anyway, so next video after this will be actually a complete build-up of the space frame. So again, a catch-up for everyone else, so you don't have to mull over every single video I've ever made, and less of me rambling on, very much like this entire episode. I'm surprised how little work I'd done and how much I actually rambled. But anyway, there is that. So thank you very much for joining me. As always, like, subscribe, comment below, etc. This has been that build. Now, get back to your build. Until next time, guys, cheers.